Hi people, how are you all? Hope you're well. Today I'm going to be making a video that probably has a target audience of about 12 people, all of whom have probably already had a lot of these thoughts or read them somewhere. But I wanted to put it all in one place together anyway, so here we go. Why King Radovid from The Witcher Netflix is not a villain, as of Season 4. Radovid seems to be a bit of a Marmite character in The Witcher. You either love him or you hate him. And personally, I think this has a lot to do with him being introduced as a love interest for Jaskier, because as a fan favourite, especially among queer viewers, a lot of people are very protective over Jaskier, and it's led to some quite strong opinions. Interpretations of Radovid's character are also influenced quite a lot for some people by the game character with the same name. Whether they've played the game or just heard rumours, and following Season 4 there's been a lot of people going around talking about how Radovid has now begun his descent into villainy, with one post-Season 4 fan-made poll about different favourites from the show, talking about favourite villains, even including him on a list next to like Vilgefortz and Emir. Personally, I strongly disagree with all of these takes, and so today I kind of want to break down Radovid's actions across Seasons 3 and 4, the main motivations behind them, and talk about why I think assuming he is now evil, just by default, is a gross misinterpretation of what happened. Whilst I do this, enjoy this lovely little illustration speedpaint I drew of Radovid, based on like one of the Season 4 screen caps. I actually drew this way back in November, and half the reason for this video is genuinely just so I have another excuse to show this off, because I was so proud of this drawing at the time. Can't believe it's taken me this long to get around to the video. So I want to begin by discussing the differences between villains and antagonists, because I think a lot of the talk about Radovid being a villain is actually just a result of people conflating these two terms when they're not the same thing. Almost every story has both a protagonist, which is usually the character whose perspective we're following, and one, if not several, antagonists. An antagonist opposes or obstructs the aims and objectives of the protagonists, effectively giving them challenges to overcome. Now, obviously, Ciri is the chief protagonist of The Witcher, however, I'll be considering Geralt, Yennefer, and Jaskier as all sharing that role for the sake of this video, because so far, Radovid's actions have mostly directly impacted Jaskier and the Hansa. As for antagonists, examples could include characters like Leo Bonhart, Vilgefortz, but would also include characters like Queen Maeve, who fights for the North and is trying to protect her kingdom. You wouldn't call her a villain, but by doing what she has to protect her people, she's actively hindering the Hansa's search for Ciri, making her technically an antagonistic force within the narrative. It's also pretty common for characters to switch between antagonism, neutrality, and even kind of an assistant protagonist role as their motives change throughout the story, which you can really see in characters like Yennefer, who was very definitely antagonistic back in Season 2 when her chief goal of regaining her magic convinced her to sacrifice Ciri, who's the protagonist. But once she realised she valued Ciri more than her magic, she was no longer in conflict, and she was eventually restored to protagonist status. Villains, on the other hand, are more of a subsection of antagonists who not only oppose the protagonists, but do so with ill intent and a desire to cause harm. The Oxford Dictionary definition of a villain is a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. In other words, there has to be active malice involved for them to count. Clear-cut villain examples in The Witcher would be characters like Vilgefortz or Leo Bonhart. Both commit horrible acts of cruelty, and both are seeking to indulge their own evil impulses and work towards their own gain and power, with little care for who gets hurt in the process. They don't just oppose or come into conflict with our protagonists, but they're actively trying to hurt them without any sort of noble or even understandable justifications for why they're doing it. The next thing that I think is really important to cover is that the Netflix show is not the games. Both the games in the show are based on the book series, and both consist of a mixture of book material and their own inventions. In fact, it's notable that the video games are all set after the end of the book series, and as such, many elements in them are inventions of the game developers, including Radovid. Radovid in the books is Vizimir's son, who is only a child during the events of the books. He's about 11, I think, and he appears in one paragraph, which implies that when he grows up, he decides to punish and expel the Redanian nobles responsible for his father's death. The games then extrapolated from this to create a grown character who started violent witch hunts, burning sorceresses indiscriminately as revenge for what Philippa did. This version of the character often obviously gets compared to the Netflix version of the character, who is also only based very loosely on that book character. For starters, he's aged up. However, since all the prejudice and villainy of the game character is an invention of the games and is not present in the books, this character actually has absolutely nothing to do with and no influence on the Netflix equivalent. They technically don't even have the copyright rights to use the game Radovid in the Netflix show. The two characters are pretty much entirely unrelated aside from their name. It's also notable that there are witch hunts occurring during the events of Season 4, but they're fueled and fed by Vilgefortz, not Radovid. Radovid has nothing to do with them, and actually during the interrogation scene in Episode 5, there's nothing in the show to suggest that there's a disproportionate number of elves or sorceresses awaiting execution in his camp, or any elves among the prisoners, despite a very similar scene in the books having that strong discrimination present. So, technically speaking, Redania has become less racist than it is in the books under Radovid, if we're using that as the measure. So what does any of this villainy versus antagonism stuff actually mean in the context of Netflix's Radovid as a character? To get to the bottom of that, I want to discuss who he actually is as a person. Obviously, most well-written villains believe themselves to be the heroes of their own stories, but from an exterior perspective, is Radovid cruel or malicious? Does he care about the consequences of his actions? Does he care about the people who might get hurt in the process? Well, it's notable that one of the very first things we learn about Radovid is that his favourite song by Jaskier is the Song of the Seven, the one that is explicitly designed to inspire non-humans to rise up against their oppressors. And as a member of the Redanian royal family, you would expect him to not be too keen on a song that is actively criticising both his court and his family. So clearly he's got a pretty reasonable level of empathy for the non-humans, even if he's not willing to directly challenge his brother on his policies. It's also notable that Radovid clearly abhors violence. When presented with Queen Hedwig's head in a box, he has an extremely visceral reaction, nearly throws up, despite there being no indication that he was particularly close to her. This is not a emotional mourning reaction because it's his sister, it's a, oh my god, there's a head in the box. This is not a man who delights in violence or cruelty. In fact, he cries when he finds his guards dead at Thaned, and most significantly of all, I think, is that during the generals' meeting in the army camp in Season 4, his first question to Dijkstra is, how many men do we risk losing if we attack Diligent? Up to this point, Radovid has shown almost zero interest in the war. He seems to be going through some kind of grief-stricken dissociation that also appears to involve a high dependence on alcohol, and this is the only time we see him try to add input into the war councils prior to his conversation with Jaskier. So I think it's very significant that his first and only concern is for the lives of the men fighting for him. And I feel like the acting choices really show how heavily those lives do weigh on him, even though realistically Dijkstra is the one calling the shots at this point, so you could argue that it's not Radovid's fault. And I think it's this scene more than anything that proves to me that Radovid, at his core, is a man who cares about other people just because they're people. Whilst all characters are capable of negative arcs and descents into villainy and wickedness, etc., it seems clear to me that he's definitely started in a position as a genuinely good person who is trying his best, even if he's not getting everything right, rather than this being a situation where he's been hiding his true evil self all along or anything like that. However, Radovid caring about others and wanting to be good is not the same as actually being good. So I'm now going to break down his actual actions and decisions across Season 4, because I am aware that it is those decisions that have led to people believing he might be a villain. Because initially, his conversation with Jaskier when they first reunite seems to be going really well. Jaskier comes in very cautious, he's anxious, he kneels, he refers to Radovid as Your Majesty, he offers his condolences, and Radovid immediately steps in to be like, nope, get up, have a hug, I've got you, you've got me, and he makes sure to establish that as far as he's concerned, and let's be honest, of the two of them, he's the one who's changed the most in the interim, but to him, their relationship is still what it was that night in Loxia before everything went horribly wrong. He treats Jaskier like an equal rather than a subject, and it never seems to occur to him to do otherwise, which I think says a lot about Radovid's headspace, but we'll get to more on that later. The point is, it's going well. It's a bit awkward, but the conversation is generally positive. Radovid immediately offers to get their espionage accusations cleared so that they can go free. He doesn't even hesitate to ask before offering his help, and then he asks Jaskier to stay with him. It's not entirely relevant to Radovid's moral character or the premise of this video, but I do want it noted that Jaskier doesn't immediately say no to his initial request that he stays. At the very least, he seems to be working on finding a gentle way to let him down and explain that he has to go back and be with Geralt and help him find Ciri. But unfortunately, he never gets the chance to give this softer version of the answer, because they're interrupted by the sound of Geralt's torture, and everything goes to hell. Now, unlike Jaskier, the audience actually has several clues already that Radovid has no idea what is going on inside his own army camp. He's clearly dissociating through a lot of both of the War Council scenes in episodes 1 and 4. He constantly has a drink in his hand, implying this drunken fool act may have started to be less of an act and more of an actual drinking problem. He's clearly grieving either for his brother or for loss of his own future that he'd hoped for, and as he openly admits, he doesn't feel as though he's strong enough to take on his role as king without Jaskier to support him. In fact, I would argue that Radovid doesn't really feel like a king at all. So we know that he means it when he says he doesn't know what's happening or how to stop it, and what Dijkstra's doing to Geralt. The moment everything goes wrong, of course, is specifically when Jaskier begs Radovid to stop Geralt's torture, and Radovid instead turns it round on him and seems to make Jaskier an offer. He'll save Geralt if Jaskier stays with him, which is obviously a horrible ultimatum to give anyone, and naturally Jaskier flips out about it. However, I want to look a little bit closer at what was actually said between them, because I think the exact phrasing of that exchange tells a very different story. When Radovid protests that Dijkstra has his own plans, Jaskier replies with, "You're the king, you get to tell people what to do." Which seems like a really obvious statement, like, obviously you're in charge, buddy, step up. But it's also entirely false. Since Radovid became king, he's been used as a puppet, first by Philippa, then by Dijkstra. He's been belittled by Queen Maeve, mocked by his own generals. We can see that no one really cared what he wanted before he became king, except maybe his brother, who's now dead. And certainly no one has cared what he wants now that he is the king. Dijkstra has already threatened to murder him once, and whilst logically he's unlikely to murder him now the throne has no heir, you can understand why Radovid is reasonably quite afraid of him. Heck, whilst the show doesn't state it explicitly, it's not entirely impossible that Radovid has figured out that Philippa is the one who had his brother killed for trying to challenge her. To hear someone say, "You're the king, you get to tell people what to do," must feel like the world's most colossal joke. Radovid's reply, "Then will you stay?" doesn't feel like bargaining or an ultimatum to me. It feels like Radovid testing Jaskier's statement. He's proving the futility of it. If he gets to tell people what to do, then surely he can ask for the only thing he wants. Except he can't, because as the audience know, there's no world in which Jaskier was going to abandon the quest for Ciri. I think it's also worth considering what Jaskier is actually asking of Radovid when he asks him to stand up to Dijkstra. Radovid is clearly terrified of Dijkstra, and would seemingly be sacrificing a lot of his own personal safety if he tried to challenge him. Not only that, but if he does intervene and successfully get Geralt and Jaskier freed, then Jaskier is going to leave him again to go back searching for Ciri, stranding him once more with all the people he doesn't trust, and now with somebody who clearly doesn't like him either because he just stood up to Dijkstra. Now obviously, ultimatums are universally a bad idea in relationships, and trying to bargain Geralt's safety, even if Radovid didn't see it that way, is a horrible thing to do. You can completely understand why Jaskier flew off the rails about it, and Jaskier is known for getting pretty savage when he's angry at somebody. Especially when we consider that Jaskier is of course missing a lot of the context we have on how much control Radovid actually has over the situation. But for all that Radovid's actions are harmful and hurtful, and definitely do prohibit the progress of the protagonists, I can't find any evidence that they're maliciously motivated. Of course, the ultimatum is not Radovid's only mistake. After Jaskier properly rakes him across the coals, he has him arrested once more. This is arguably the first step he actually takes to obstruct the protagonists, as opposed to taking more of a bystander role to whatever Dijkstra was up to. But once again, I don't think it's maliciously motivated. Jaskier calls him weak, tells him he's going to die alone, just like his brother, and it's an incredibly intense moment. So, can you really blame the poor guy for wanting to get away from him, even if it's just in that moment? Of course, there is the pending execution that Visegard has planned for Geralt and Jaskier, and sending your love interest to be executed is very much not okay. But I genuinely don't believe Radovid had any knowledge of that whatsoever. Dijkstra didn't even know that Marshal Visegard had taken prisoners until Eva told him about it. There seems to be no integration between the Redanian and Cintran forces, and as mentioned earlier, Radovid's been in a drunken haze for months. I am not at all trying to say that having your love interest arrested for arguing with you is an okay thing to do. It's so clearly not. But what I am trying to say is that this seemed like an impulse decision to me, and one that Radovid presumed would be reversible if he changed his mind about it. He wasn't, as far as I can tell, trying to put Jaskier in harm's way or intending for him to get killed. All this brings me on to what happened next. Obviously, Jaskier and Geralt escape the army camp in the middle of the night, and they don't cross paths with Radovid again for the rest of the season. But that doesn't mean there isn't any further evidence that whilst he acted antagonistically, Radovid didn't act villainously. The big one is, of course, his dismissal of Dijkstra. Now, on a surface level, this seems slightly suspicious. He wouldn't confront Dijkstra on Jaskier's behalf, but he would do it for himself after their argument. Of course, everyone has their own interpretations of this, and there are Doyleist reasons for it as well, but that kind of doesn't matter at this point. But my theory is that losing Jaskier, emotionally speaking, pushed Radovid to take control because he reached a point where he had nothing left to lose. I think there's also probably an element of vengeance in there as well, since he partially blames Dijkstra for what happened, as did Geralt, interestingly enough. And I also think it wasn't until Jaskier pushed him hard enough and he stood up to Jaskier that it really hit home for Radovid that he's not completely powerless. It is notable that when dismissing Dijkstra, he refers to Jaskier as my friend the Bard, clearly speaking about him in a positive light, which suggests that despite everything Jaskier said to him, Radovid still thinks of him quite fondly. He also specifies that Dijkstra's games have done damage he can never undo, which implies he's fully aware that he made mistakes and damaged his relationship with Jaskier. He knows he's in the wrong and he isn't trying to pretend otherwise. It even implies that he would like to undo that damage if he thought it was at all possible, and that he doesn't hold Jaskier responsible for any of it. I also want to highlight that despite Dijkstra effectively taking away the only thing Radovid really cared about, Radovid does not have him killed. Arguably a little short-sighted of him, knowing what Dijkstra is capable of, but I think it highlights again that Radovid is not a violent man, nor does he enjoy suffering for the sake of it, even for those who've hurt him. The punishment is Dijkstra losing his place in Redania, which both frees Radovid, so is a practical move, and is also the only thing Dijkstra really cares about, so it's suitable punishment for the crime. Radovid notably also doesn't kill or even fire the general who mocked him in the beginning of the episode. He makes sure that the man knows that he isn't a pushover anymore and reminds him of where his place is, but he gives the man a second chance and lets him keep his job. All of this leads me to believe that he probably did intend to free Geralt and Jaskier following his dismissal of Dijkstra, or at the very least renegotiate the terms of their imprisonment. But unfortunately, we just don't know if he would have, because we never get any scene in which Radovid reacts to their escape from his custody. Which does feel like a little bit of an oversight to me, as it makes it that much harder for the audience to tell where he stands. One of the things that was really reassuring following their reconciliation in Season 3 was the later scene that showed Radovid asking for permission to leave his royal life behind and go find Jaskier. It made it clear that his true intentions were to be with Jaskier and to aid him, and it's a pity we don't have that same reassurance. However, basically everyone excluding maybe the core Hansa members end Season 4 on a bit of a narrative low, so I have hope that in Season 5 things might pick up again. After the dismissal scene, we only see Radovid twice more. A brief clip of him during the battle, somehow holding his own, and then again in episode 5 when he discovers the truth about the fake Princess Ciri that Emhyr has in his court. We don't really learn anything to either support or contradict the villain theory in this scene, aside from the fact that the prisoners and those facing execution do appear to be mostly human, as opposed to the heavy elven percentage in the books. But one thing I do find interesting from a narrative structural point of view is the fact that this scene even exists. Later in the season, Yennefer also discovers the fake Ciri, and notifies the relevant parties, particularly the Hansa, the Sorceress' Lodge, meaning if the show needed a way for the rumours about fake Ciri to get out, they already had it through Yennefer and all the people she told. But the fact that we see Radovid discovering this for himself suggests he's going to personally use that information somehow next season. Whether he uses it for the sake of Redania or as a way to repair his relationship with Jaskier, I really wouldn't be able to guess. So, to conclude, In Season 2, Yasuke tells Geralt, people do stupid things when they think they're trapped in a corner. And that's exactly my read of Radovid's actions in Season 4. He's lost everything, he's clearly terrified, and to be honest, I think he's put Yasuke on a bit of a pedestal as the one thing that might save him. So when Yasuke starts pushing him to intervene, starts challenging him, he does what any frightened animal would do, and he lashes out. To completely catastrophic effect. He makes some truly terrible decisions, but he does it out of fear and a feeling of complete and utter powerlessness, which is only exacerbated by Yasuke's own fear and concern, both for Geralt and himself. They freak each other out to the point that it spirals out of control, faster than anyone can do anything about. In banishing Dijkstra, Radovid regains some of that power, and he actually has agency of his own for the first time, potentially since he was introduced in Season 3. However, even once he has the power to make decisions for himself, there's no real evidence of him abusing that power in any sort of way. Despite everything that happened and believing their relationship to be over and pretty much doomed, he still references Yasuke in a positive light. He treats his subordinates with kindness. In Season 4, Radovid is undoubtedly an antagonist, even if he's been manipulated into becoming one by Dijkstra. His decisions are still his own, and he should be held accountable for them. However, I see no evidence that he is a villain. Of course, that could change in Season 5. He might go off the deep end, he might use his intel to begin hunting Ciri, intending to capture her for himself, or hurt her, or use her as a bargaining chip. But just as likely, he might use that information to try and aid Yennefer and the Hansa. He might take actions to improve their chances of survival. Or he might remain more neutral and focus on winning the war in the north without ever crossing paths with the Hansa or Jaskier again. All of these things are possible, although I would actually consider it least probable that he goes off the deep end and becomes a villain, simply because I believe it would contradict his established character in such a way that there would need to be a bigger catalyst for it. How does the man who's been kind to the people beneath him suddenly go power mad and start killing everybody? It doesn't really make sense. If you have your own thoughts on Radovid, I'm sure I didn't cover everything, but please leave them down in the comments. I'm so excited to hear from other people who like this show and actually enjoy it. But yeah, I will hopefully see you all soon. Bye.